Hey all, Ben here. So this tutorial will cover all the basics for preparing, exporting and importing your meshes into the game engine, setting up levels of detail, managing collisions, particle effects and all other elements required for a ship to function properly in-game. We will not cover the modeling and texturing itself, but we will start from the prepared meshes, which you can find and download from the link in the video description. It's also important to mention that a textual version of this tutorial holds more information, as we had to collapse its size for the sake of video length. So yeah, let's begin. You can work in 3ds Max or Blender, as our importer will handle their exported OBJ files. Regarding the texturing, any software should do it as long as it supports DDS file formats. For this tutorial, we will use our exemplar gunship class. Download the files from the previously mentioned link. Should you decide to model the ship, you'll have to follow some rules regarding their size. Depending on its class, if you look at the following list, you can see that each class has its own size. For example, Corvette is usually 2 times bigger than a gunship. A battleship, on the other hand, is almost 20 times bigger than a gunship. We tend to keep the poly count up to around 30,000 tri. Of course, it all depends on the ship class itself. Bigger the ship class, higher the poly count. Now, let's cover the basics and models exporting. Let's take a look at our first image. This is the layout that's representing all the meshes needed for the game. We will work on the exemplar gunship class, as its basic hull length is approximately 3.5 generic units. So let's go through these meshes one at a time. Here we have the main mesh, or in this case, multiple meshes. Each object has its own material assigned to it. However, it's not important to have your ship made out of those multiple meshes. As long as you do use more meshes, keep in mind to have the pivots of those objects on the same coordinates before the export. In our case, Exemplar is made out of 7 separate objects. Engines and decals are on separate meshes since they use different shaders. The next image shows 3 LOD, or in other words, levels of detail. Certain objects, such as decals and lights, don't have to be part of the actual object, as we can simply switch them off over the material editor. Keep in mind that picots are mandatory to be set at the same coordinates as the base mesh. Concave collision mesh is a single simplified mesh used for detecting a weapon's hit. Convex collision meshes create a set of 4 objects, with pivots at the same coordinates as the base mesh. These are not attached since they have to remain convex at all times and are exported individually. Derelict mesh spawns in-game when a ship in question is destroyed and uses, at least in this case, the same collisions as the base ship. Next thing you want to do is ungroup and position all meshes to the 0, 0, 0 coordinates and convert them to editable meshes. Now, you are ready to export them with the following setup and options. We now have 25 OBJ files ready for importing. So now, it's time to cover the basics of the material editor. First, find the material editor configuration.cfg file within your game root directory to set up the desired resolution. Next, double-click the material editor.exe to open the editor itself. You will be welcomed with the following screen. Its default tab is Assembly Editor, a container for all meshes, particle effects, LODs, and collisions. Next, we have a model editor for material parameters, shader choices, and so on. The particle editor is used to set up your particle emitter and its properties. The last tool in the main tool section is the ship editor, needed to complete the ship's creation process. Here, you set up the number and arc of a turret per battery. Now's the time to cover some basics about the texturing. First, make sure you've downloaded the exemplar tutorial files before proceeding. You'll also need a 2D editing software. We use Photoshop in combination with certain NVIDIA plugins. Links to the plugin can be found in the video description. Warlords use 3 textures: diffuse, normal, and special texture. The format we use is DDS 8888, ARGB 32BPP with optional bitmaps. First, take a look at the diffuse map. It's important to note that its alpha channel represents the opacity mask, with a black pixel being a transparent one. Normal map is also a standard texture, baked or generated. Special map is slightly different. It might look weird at first, since every channel in this texture represents a different map. Red channel is used as a specular, green as a glossiness, and blue channel as the self-illumination mask. In the last one, the white pixel lets that particular pixel from a diffuse map to render with self-illumination and glow. With the basics out of the way, let's actually import the models into the game. Open your game root directory and navigate to Data Models Ships. Create a new folder, Exemplar Tutorial, and paste all of your previously exported OBJ and texture files into it. Click on the Import New Model button and navigate to your Exemplar Tutorial folder. Import each file and save it as a whale model, or as a collision whale model if you're importing collision meshes. Don't worry about them being rendered as black, we'll fix that later. Once we're done, we will get an additional 25 MDL files. To assemble these models, launch the editor again and click on the New Assembly button to empty the current file. Next, right-click on the Elements window and in the drop-down menu, choose the Add Mesh. This will create a simple box model as a placeholder. With MDL box selected in your list, select the Model Editor tab in the upper left corner. This action will open the properties of your model. With Load Whale Model option, navigate and load your MDL file to switch the box model. The first model we need is the Attachable MDL. Now go back to the Assembly tab, add another mesh through the Model Editor tab, and replace the newly added box with another ship part. Repeat the procedure with all your base meshes. Once you're done, you should have something like this. Save the assembly file in your ship's directory and name it Exemplar Tutorial ASB. At this point, we are ready to set up the materials. Launch the editor and load the Exemplar Tutorial ASB. On your elements list, select the MDL Metal 1 and open the Model Editor tab. First, we need to check if the right shader is loaded. In a section a bit below, you choose your model's textures. For Metal 1, load all 3 textures you've downloaded with our tutorial files, each one in its appropriate container. With shader and textures loaded in, you can now set up the basic parameters such as normal scale, glossiness, specular level, self-illumination, and everything else like that. Don't forget to resave the metal.mdl so you don't lose your changes. The procedure is almost the same for all the models. The only difference, more or less, are different parameters for each desired model. Now, we've got all the base models and materials, except for engines, configured and saved. The result of a completed assembly file can be seen here. Now's the time to deal with the levels of details, rendering distance, and bounding sphere. Since we already imported the LOD levels for our ship, we only need to assign them to our base models. Open the material editor and load the exemplar tutorial.asb. Let's configure LOD levels and rendering distances for Metal 1 part of the ship. In your elements list, select MDL Metal 1. You'll notice an LOD section a bit below with listed default tag, designating your main mesh and the one with the highest poly count. Right-click in the section and from the drop-down menu, select Add LOD. Navigate to your Exemplar Tutorial folder and open Metal1-LOD1MDL file. Use the same way to add all 3 LOD levels to the list. When done, the list should look like this. Now, you can assign the material from default mesh on each LOD level by right-clicking on each LOD level and using Copy Material option. This will copy and paste the entire base material and its properties to an LOD level that you've selected. Repeat the procedure for all the models that have their LOD meshes, so Metal 1, Metal 2, Black, Attachable, and when you're done, save the changes to assembly. With all LODs loaded in and materials configured, now is a good time to set up rendering and streaming distances of all the meshes and their levels of detail. For each model and LOD, you can set up these parameters right below the LOD list section. Stream distance stands for a range the model will start to load in, while the render distance naturally stands for a range from camera the mesh will start to render on screen. Now would also be a good time to set up the bounding sphere of your ship. This sphere is an important part of any model setup as it greatly optimizes the frame rate. With it, try to encompass the entire assembly, keeping no parts of the assembly out of it, but also do not leave too much of free space around it. Okay, let's add the collision meshes now. Remember the 5 collision meshes we've imported a few steps back and saved them as the collision whale models? We have 2 types of collision meshes. Collision used for to-hit calculations is the first one. Here, we're talking about a single, greatly optimized mesh that is used in calculations if the assembly has been hit with a weapon or not. The second one is used for calculating if 2 objects collide or crash with one another. An important note here is that this mesh needs to be convex for physics to work properly. Great. Now's the time to attach the files with the assembly file. Open Exemplar Tutorial ASB with Notepad or Notepad++ and scroll to the end of the file. At the end, you will see a waypoint data chunk. We need to add the collisions right above that chunk with the paths to your models. When done, save the file. Now, let's configure the engines. This model should be separately imported into the game as it will have a different shader and material from the rest of the assembly. First, we have to change the material of the .mdl file in question. Let's do this through the notepad this time. Navigate to data/model/ships/exemplar tutorial and open engines.mdl. Replace the entire material data chunk with the following one. The code shown on the screen can be found in the text version of the tutorial linked in the video description. Once material is replaced, save the file. The last thing to do is tagging this model to behave like thrusters in the game. Open your exemplar tutorial.asb and find the static mesh chunk where engines.mdl is linked. Here, the only thing you have to do is replace the default additional sort with the ship engine tag. Once done, the whole chunk should look like this. Once replaced, save the file. Last thing we need to do is set up the derelict assembly. This particular model must have its own assembly file, so let's launch materialeditor.exe and create a new clean assembly. Add a new mesh and load in derelict.mdl file. Set up the material with the needed shader, spg-pbr-shader.fx, and textures, derelict diff, derelict norm, and derelict spec. Save the model as derelict mdl and assembly file as derelict asb. Since our derelict mesh looks nearly similar to a full base mesh, we shall use and link the collision models from our exemplar tutorial.asb. Copy and paste the collision chunks from the original file to your derelict.asb. With model and assembly completed, we have to link it with the exemplar ship in order for it to spawn after destruction. Navigate to data/models/derelicts. Here you'll find folders for all the ships available in-game. In each folder there is a file called the rec.der. These files contain base preferences and scripts that trigger in-game, and also a path to a designated derelict assembly file. Create a new folder called exemplar tutorial and copy-paste any rec.der file mentioned into it. open the added file in Notepad and change the model name path to lead to your derelict.asb file like this. Once done, save the file, navigate to data/base, and open editor derelicts.wdt file in the Notepad or Notepad++. Here, you simply add one more line that will lead to your DER file. You have to add a unique ID, a unique key name, and of course, a valid path to your file like seen on the screen. Save the file. Now, we've got a full package set for a derelict assembly to spawn after the ship's destruction. The ship's schematics and icons is the last part of the tutorial needed for a fully imported ship. However, it's best if you refer to the end of the textual guide. So, good luck guys! Make sure to contact us or leave in the comments should you find any problems with the guide. This is Ben, signing out.